Tonight on Witness, did scientists inadvertently cause the AIDS epidemic?
An experimental oral polio vaccine that was prepared, I believe, in chimpanzee kidneys and chimpanzee blood, and which was fed to over 1 million Africans, correlates so precisely with the first appearances of AIDS.
Could it have been the polio vaccine? And why are scientists so ready to dismiss the possibility?
We go by evidence, and in the end, hard evidence wins the day.
The origins of AIDS, exploring the theory that won't go away.
"26 million dead, 40 million infected, and the continent of Africa devastated. In 20 years, AIDS has become the worst medical catastrophe ever experienced by humankind."
When you stop and think, 100 million people in the next 50 years are going to die of HIV disease prematurely. It's not a disease like cancer of old people. It's a disease of young people. And it's one of the great human tragedies of all time. The West has ignored it. Ronald Reagan ignored it. George Bush Sr. ignored it. Bill Clinton ignored it. And it has spread and spread and spread and spread.
The origins of AIDS remain a mystery about which the scientific community has long kept silent. Is it lack of interest or fear of knowing? A few lone voices have asked the question and attempted to break this code of silence. By following in the footsteps of these dedicated men into the heart of Africa where it all began, we were able to relocate the places, trails, and witnesses of one of the worst tragedies we've ever known. HIV, the causative virus of AIDS, was first isolated in 1983 by Luc Montagnier's team at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. Simon Wayne Hobson was part of the team.
When this first came, people thought that this bomb from nowhere necessitated sort of novel explanations. And no one really knew. There was no cousin, if you wish, to this sort of virus known in the animal kingdom at that point.
But a cousin did exist. And in France in 1989, researchers identified it among chimpanzees. They named it SIV, the simian immunodeficiency virus, analogous to HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus. The two viruses' similarities prompted the researchers to designate SIV as HIV's ancestor.
And the immediate precursor to the virus that's going around the world is chimpanzees. We're all agreed on that. We can discuss when, why, how, but we all agree on the chimpanzee. So when, I think there's a consensus to say it's this century. Where? Clearly, the epicenter in humans is the northeast Zaire, Uganda.
This region, in the heart of chimpanzee country, was part of the Belgian Congo during the 1950s. Professor Van de Piet, a Belgian physician, collected human blood samples there in 1959 and gave them to a colleague to test many years later.
Et nous avons prélevé presque 2000 sérums d'adultes. Et c'est beaucoup plus tard qu'il les a donnés à des experts pour voir s'il n'y avait pas de traces de HIV. Or, il y a un laboratoire qui a trouvé un seul sérum séropositif et ça a été confirmé par plusieurs autres laboratoires. Et je crois que dans la littérature en général, on considère ça le premier sérum séropositif pour le sida avant l'ère du sida. Le numéro était L70 et elle vient de Léopoldville.
We have the date, 1959, and the place, Leopoldville, former capital of the Belgian Congo, today known as Kinshasa. This first evidence of AIDS emerged more than 20 years before the rise of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in America.
So if you went back and said, well, HIV is related to SIV, to the monkey AIDS virus, where do humans have contact with monkeys? Well, the average person has no contact with monkeys. There are only two ways that you could have contact with monkeys that I can figure. One is you have people who eat monkeys, and in so doing, they clean the monkey and with a sharp knife or a dull knife or what have you, and can become infected that way. The other way is that we used vaccines that were made from monkeys that we injected into people.
The scientific community has always favored the hunter theory, where SIV crossed over into humans as a result of killing or eating chimps. However, it fails to explain why AIDS has appeared only recently, since monkeys have been hunted and eaten across Africa for hundreds of years. Another, more disturbing theory emerged in 1992. An article published in Rolling Stone magazine by freelance journalist Tom Curtis linked the origin of AIDS to the polio vaccine.
It looked at the polio campaign that Dr. Kaprowski had undertaken in the former Belgian Congo in the middle to late 1950s. And I did focus on that campaign because of certain geographic similarities to where scientists were saying AIDS had begun in the human population, which was in this same region.
Curtis's hypothesis shook up the scientific community because it questioned the work of Hilary Kaprowski, a famous researcher and pioneer in the fight against polio.
There was a tremendous feeling in the scientific community that they were somehow endangered. If you had journalists writing articles in the Rolling Stone, my God, what about our dignity? So there was a lot of concern from that viewpoint. There was a lot of concern that it was written by a person who was a professional journalist, and that they were afraid that people would no longer immunize their children against polio.
To understand Curtis's questions about how the polio vaccine was produced in this region of Africa, let's return to the polio years. In 1958, America was still haunted by this disease, which had been paralyzing and killing mostly children for 50 years. In one of the largest mass vaccination campaigns ever, 90 million Americans were vaccinated. A great success of modern medicine, it transformed its inventor, Jonas Salk, into a hero.
All 164 million Americans, to say nothing of all the other people in the world, will profit from your discovery. I am very, very happy to end that.
The polio vaccine was the first to be derived from monkey organs. Mass commercialization created an enormous market for monkeys, used both as guinea pigs and raw material from which to create the polio vaccine. In America, entire shipments of macaque monkeys arrived from India and the Philippines. During the polio years, Hilary Kaprowski was a young researcher, brilliant and ambitious, determined to make a name for himself in his newly adopted country, the USA. In 1950, while Jonas Salk's formula was being widely used, Kaprowski began testing his own prototype of a live polio vaccine. A scandal erupted when it was discovered he'd been testing his product secretly on handicapped children in Letchworth Village, New York. That didn't slow him down. He turned to the private sector to continue his testing. On April 23, 1955, 260 children vaccinated with Jonas Salk's formula became sick. 11 died. A subsequent investigation showed that some vaccine lots were defective. Confidence in Salk's vaccine was shaken, clearing the way for Kaprowski. But he was no longer alone. Another scientific giant, Albert Sabin, was also developing a live vaccine. A race between these two men to replace the Salk vaccine turned into a battle.
So you have these two conflicting individuals who are all working towards the same goal. And it's one of the great dramas of modern times of how they interacted and how they worked. They were willing to go and take subjects who may or may not have been informed of what they were doing. They were willing to go to the backside of the moon if it meant that they could find out whether or not they had a viable product.
To win this race, they had to test. And to test, they needed large, non-immunized population groups, something no longer available in America. Sabin made a secret deal with his native country, the USSR, where he vaccinated more than 6 million people in Latvia, Estonia, and Kazakhstan. Kaprowski chose an African country in full expansion, the Belgian Congo. A jewel of the colonial empire, it had one of Africa's best organized and most modern healthcare infrastructures at the time.
L'Institut Princesse Astrid est un des laboratoires médicaux les plus importants et les plus complets de l'Afrique centrale. Il dispose d'un personnel nombreux et d'un matériel ultramoderne, tant pour l'exécution des analyses courantes que pour la recherche scientifique et la préparation de vaccins et sérums utilisés dans la lutte contre diverses maladies infectieuses. La sollicitude des services officiels s'étend spécialement aux enfants, l'avenir même du pays. Dès l'école, tous les enfants sont soumis à des examens médicaux et à cette occasion reçoivent un carnet de santé, véritable fiche d'identité sanitaire.
There was therefore flawless subject monitoring, making the indigenous population a wonderful experimentation group.
Return to political quiet. After the recent disturbances, Leopoldville engages in an all-out fight against infantile paralysis, crowding every clinic with mothers and their children, the latter to receive orally administered shots of a new vaccine against the scourge of childhood. It is a live virus preparation developed in the United States by Philadelphia's Dr. Hilary Kaprowski, and it differs from our famed Salk vaccine in that it does away with injections. And it must taste good if the children's receptivity to it is a criterion.
Sabin and Kaprowski conducted their experiments at the same time, both using a live oral polio vaccine. No AIDS cases emerged in the USSR where Sabin did his testing. But in the Congo, where Kaprowski's vaccine was used, the first AIDS case surfaced 1 year after the vaccination campaigns. Was there, as Curtis suggested, something different in Kaprowski's vaccine? In 1958, Albert Sabin analyzed Kaprowski's vaccine, called CHAT, and found it to be unstable, contaminated by an unknown virus, which he designated Virus X. He told Kaprowski about the findings and received this response. Dear Albert, I have carefully considered your extraordinary letter of November 17th, with its even more extraordinary enclosures. I cannot imagine for a moment that I would dismiss 10 years of work by another investigator with one airy wave of an intraspinal needle. Sir, your letter of December 1st does not merit a reply. It is clear that dispassionate analysis and discourse are impossible for you. Sarcasm and invectives do not take the place of reproducible facts in science. Farewell, my one-time friend and colleague. Sabin moved quickly to make his findings public. In June 1960, his vaccine, deemed more reliable, was chosen to replace Salk's. Kaprowski had lost the race. In his Rolling Stone article, Tom Curtis echoed Albert Sabin's findings. Kaprowski's vaccine was contaminated with a virus. He went on to say it was a monkey virus, citing the African green monkey as the source. And there, Curtis made a major mistake. The green monkey does not carry SIV, HIV's predecessor, unlike the African chimp. This was enough to discredit Curtis's findings.
Hilary Kaprowski felt that his honor had been defiled and that he had been done serious injury. The Rolling Stone folded under and publicly apologized for having published the article. And that was, as they say, that for the time being.
The story could have ended there, but one man decided there were many questions left unanswered. Edward Hooper, a British journalist, went to Africa to pursue the path of polio vaccinations. He was convinced that Kaprowski used the SIV-carrying chimpanzees to make his polio vaccine. During 17 years, he interviewed hundreds of participants and observers of the period and collected thousands of relevant documents. In 1999, Hooper published the results of his research in a book of more than 1,000 pages, and once again, the scientific community was rocked.
Good evening. Could AIDS have been accidentally caused by scientists? A new book claims HIV has its origins in apes and monkeys and was passed on to humans when scientists in Africa used primate tissue in a mass vaccination campaign against polio. I'll be asking the book's author whether his allegations stand up.
AIDS came about as an act of man, not as an act of God. An experimental oral polio vaccine that was prepared, I believe, in chimpanzee kidneys and chimpanzee blood, and which was fed to over 1 million Africans in the Belgian Congo, in Rwanda, and in Burundi between 1957 and 1960, correlates so precisely with the first appearances of AIDS that I think what we have here is the route whereby this chimpanzee virus arrived in humans.
The intensity of the debate and the depth of Hooper's research forced Hilary Kaprowski to respond.
The tissue which I used were kidneys obtained either monkeys from Philippines or from India, which was rhesus monkey, this is the normal term, and there are two other species, Macaca mulata, I forgot the name of the species from Philippines. And this is documented in print.
So you never used chimpanzees to...
Oh, never in my life.
Oddly, there were no existing documents showing how Kaprowski made his chat vaccine. But archive footage from Kaprowski's chimp facility can shed some light.
Au Congo belge, le camp de polio, dirigé par le docteur Courtois, compte 86 chimpanzés sur lesquels on pratique régulièrement des essais en injectant le vaccin anti-polio inventé en 1947 par le docteur Kaprowski. Les animaux sont placés dans des cages dont une des parois est mobile et permet d'approcher plus facilement les singes pour les injections hypodermiques. Ainsi se poursuit une lutte implacable contre une des plus terribles maladies non encore vaincues.
So Kaprowski's research camp did house chimpanzees, and was in fact one of the largest chimp facilities ever created to date.
Well over 400 chimpanzees were brought to Lindy Camp in the space of less than 2 years between 1956 and 1958, and that with one or two notable exceptions, animals which were favourites, which were treated as pets, that every single one of these chimpanzees ended up dead. The question has to be, why were they killed?
Hooper found an ally for his theory. Bill Hamilton was a renowned scientist, the most important evolutionary biologist since Darwin. And Hamilton felt there was a 95% chance that this theory was correct.
Is there a possibility here scientists simply don't want to know, don't want to accept perhaps at least the moral, if not the legal liability for what has been done, for the AIDS virus?
I feel that this is so, and as one of the most worrying aspects of the case, I feel it's not only the origin of AIDS that is in question here, it is the conduct of science towards this hypothesis, which has been one of almost paranoid rejection, I would say. I think I would not exaggerate to describe it as medical science's worst hated hypothesis, and there seems to be a great reluctance to publish anything about it or to test any of the available evidence that could be more directly tested.
Bill Hamilton made 2 trips to Africa to collect chimpanzee samples. Sadly, during the second trip, he contracted malaria and died in March 2000. Before his death, Hamilton had asked the Royal Society of Scientists in London, England, to stage a debate on the hunter versus the vaccine theory of the origin of AIDS. In his memory, the conference went ahead. Edward Hooper was invited to present his evidence to Kaprowski and the scientific community. It was the first time they had ever invited a non-scientist to debate a theory with renowned experts in the field.
I am not to defend myself. Hooper has to defend himself. Certainly this meeting is very welcome. I think it's a good meeting. It's an unusual meeting. That a journalist presents a hypothesis without facts, and here come the scientists and give him all the scientific facts.
I think we're going to have a real debate today. I think it's going to be a worthwhile debate. I don't think it's between Kaprowski and myself. I think it's about something far more important than that.
From the opening of the conference, arguments were launched against Hooper's theory. Even the date when AIDS emerged among men was challenged. But the final blow to Hooper was a surprise announcement that samples of Kaprowski's vaccine had been located and tested and contained no trace of HIV, SIV, or chimp DNA. That left little room for Hooper to respond.
This did offend Ed Hooper, because he was clearly the underdog at the meeting. But science is a very cruel culture. We go by evidence, and although we may be fooled in our interpretation, we may fool ourselves in misinterpreting evidence, in the end, hard evidence wins the day.
But the scientific evidence that signaled the death knell for the polio vaccine theory needed to be re-examined. Exactly what was tested?
The actual samples that were used in the Congo between late 1957 and the beginning of 1960, of course, don't exist anymore. They were used. But one of the samples tested was the very same lot of virus as Hooper thinks is by far the most likely to have been contaminated that was used in the Congo, the chat 10A11.
Similar samples? Maybe. But the real question is, was it or was it not used in the Congo?
This was discovered here in the UK, who had received it in 1981 from the State Serum Institute in Stockholm, who in turn had received it from the Wistar Institute around the time it was made. And it was sealed and had never been opened.
So the sample remained sealed since it was made at Kaprowski's laboratory. All one can say for certain is that it was never used in the Congo. Is this enough scientific rigor to use as a decisive statement against the polio vaccine theory?
This was another event in which the scientists eventually conjoined and had a public lynching in London for the Royal Society, in which they once again claimed to have laid rest to the idea that HIV could have come from polio vaccine. And I don't think they did a better job than they had done before. There are still great gaping holes in their story.
We wanted to see for ourselves if SIV-carrying chimpanzees were used just for testing or if their organs were used to make Kaprowski's vaccine. So we returned to the Congo, where it all took place. This is Stanleyville, Belgian Congo's former capital. On the outskirts of town lie the remains of the vast Stanleyville Medical Laboratory. In 1957, it was a sparkling new facility where Kaprowski set up his operations to produce and test his polio vaccine on the local people. Camp Lindy, which housed the chimpanzees, was built on a peninsula of the Lindy River, 40 minutes upstream from Stanleyville. To get there, we had to take the road and then a ferry to cross the river. During his research, Edward Hooper had found Christophe Bayello, one of the assistants working at Camp Lindy. Bayello agreed to guide us there. In the 1950s, he was in charge of caring for and feeding the chimpanzees.
Nakanisi turbanaka na ke tango bamindele bangu baye biso tukula ba travailleur to baka makambo ta komela kaka baye basali nini ba polio na bango wana ba kusala ba operation wana biso peto kipina ya mote oya jaki ko yeba bere infirmière da ko yeba secret wana.
What secret is Bayello talking about? In the jungle, only a few traces remain, but other images bring these abandoned sites back to life. These photographs were taken by Tom Norton, Kaprowski's right-hand man. The photos help date one of Kaprowski's trips to the Congo, February 1957. It corresponds to an event, the first big influx of chimpanzees to Camp Lindy. More than 100 chimpanzees, an exorbitant number, captured in about 15 days. An important visit, it's immortalized with a symbolic handshake between the two co-founders, Ghislain Courtois and Hilary Kaprowski. In this photo are the 11 camp assistants, including Christophe Bayello and Joseph Limbaya, one of two nurses who observed firsthand what was taking place at Lindy.
Atungaki wana mobele pona ko tusalaka tutiaka mobele banyama yango wana tuti banyama wana soko basingi yango pona ko buma yango to bumi yango nataka ko buma mokolo moko na ko buma mibale to misato nde simango nasali autopsie. Nakosala autopsie nakokata awa nakati awa yoso nakobimisa foie ezali oyebi soyebi foie tode kolongola yango misuni te misuni yawa te mbuma yango yali kuna mibale kuna to ikobenga rein nde doktele akoya na yango ayena yangawa na Kisangani awa na laboratoire pana kotinda na Amerika pana kotinda yango na Amerika.
Docteur nani oyo ozalaki kosala na ye mutu ya Belgique?
Ona jayo sana ye Paul Osterite.
According to Joseph, Paul Osterith, the lab's head of virology, was in charge of killing the chimpanzees.
Liboso nano basa bango autopsie alo ikuza soki nyama mine soki mitano mokolo yango kopesa bango biloko te mokolo mosusu nde baye babeti bango tonga tonga wana ezali pona bala lokola ponge bakomi lokola paralysé bazali soso makasi te mais bakufi te bazali soso makasi te nde simango balotongoli baki kosala ba opération yango lokola tomoni awa bango na basuzevu baki kosala sema yango nde babwaki batokundi yango kolia te bwaka tango bakosala opération na nyama ezali ezali nano mobimba ekomona ekoloba.
Joseph describes what he did, Bayello what he witnessed. Their two accounts reveal that the Lindy staff systematically harvested organs from the camp's chimps. So that's how it was, like this day in Lindy, filmed by a team member. What Joseph and Bayello revealed was that some animals were dissected alive. And the main reason in those days for harvesting living organs was to make tissue cultures needed to make the polio vaccine. Jacques Kanyama and Philippe Elebe both worked in the Department of Virology with Paul Ostereth.
Au département de la virologie, on fabriquait des vaccins parce que après la fabrication, on met dans des flacons de 50 millilitres et on met des étiquettes aussi. Ce n'était pas une chose à cassette. Il y avait des étiquettes et on avait écrit aussi les vaccins anti-polio.
Ezali vaccin ya kotia na munoko ya maladi nini?
Mais soki otai de près koki kusala vaccin ezalaki kokwa kusala vaccin ya poliomyélite ya bana mike.
Bino boyebaki ndenge nini kasi lokola ye mpe bandeki kosalaka ba vaccin ye docteur Ostereth?
Parce que ngai nayebi te ye nde asalaka parce que ntango ye abengisaka ngai ke yaka oprépare baflacon atindaki yo po osukula yango tia stérile tokotia vaccin kuna ezali vaccin aprépare yango atie na mwa nini moko boye ya stérile nde ngai nakendaki nde kotiatia na parce que soki eutaki mosika ekoki koya bongo te ezali kiyende moto afabrike yango.
Paul Ostereth refused to speak with us, but he was categorical in his public denial before the Royal Society when he stated, "It never would have occurred to me to risk human life and my own reputation on material prepared under such primitive conditions. I categorically deny that I ever did that." Gaston Inan was also at Camp Lindi. He was a microbiologist who took part in the vaccination campaigns in other parts of Africa. Edward Hooper first interviewed him in November 1992 and recorded the conversation.
The virus was cultivated on kidney cells, chimpanzee kidney cells. At this time, the tissue culture was made in bottle like this.
Yes.
C'était comme ça. And this was at the beginning because the kidney cell and the kidney cell multiply easily. And it was a good substrate for the polio virus.
Oh, I see. So this is quite extraordinary. Now, in the end, he always retracts the chimpanzee kidney cells and just says, I don't know which type of monkey kidney. But the point is, he repeatedly says that they were making it on chimpanzee kidney. I had no choice when I wrote The River but to accept his retraction, to accept his final version of events. And Gaston Inan is now dead. But I believe very firmly that the original version that he gave me was the correct one.
The few remaining records from Camp Lindi make it clear that exams and organ extractions were conducted in a very systematic fashion. While Kaprowski and Ostereth insisted that they would never use chimp kidneys to make polio vaccines, research at the time pointed directly to the chimpanzee. From 1953, Alexander Jezierski, a veterinarian known by Kaprowski, conducted research in eastern Congo on behalf of the Pasteur Institute. He was looking for the best medium to use for the polio vaccine. In his comparative study of all African monkeys, chimpanzees topped the list. The chimp, always the chimp, genetically so close to humans. Were they used to create the vaccine given to 1 million African people? Many of the Camp Lindi scientists deny that chimps were used to make the polio vaccine. But Pierre Dupang is not so sure. He was in charge of laboratory testing at the time.
C'est évident que le chimpanzé est intervenu dans la composition du vaccin anti-polio. Mais à quel stade, à quel niveau, moi je n'en sais rien. Je ne vois pas pourquoi on aurait fait tant d'histoires que ça avec les chimpanzés. si ça n'avait pas été pour s'en servir pour avoir un but scientifique, en fait. Mais c'était avant tout un but scientifique pour lequel on les employait. Non, j'ai plus rien à dire. Je vais parler assez comme ça. De parler de toi-même.
Two months after our meeting, Edward Hooper saw Dupang, and during this recorded conversation, he says a bit more.
Of making the culture.
The culture was sterile. And I put the culture sterile. I was sterile to Anida. I don't know to do what I don't know.
Let me ask you one last thing, Pierre, before I go. How many times then would you say that you were making the sterile tissue culture from chips for Australia? A long time.
Dupang sheds light on the true situation at the time, and it makes sense that the polio vaccine would have been made locally for the vaccination campaigns in Africa.
And what I discovered was that routinely, all the people who were making oral polio vaccine used one particular method. They didn't send gallons of their vaccine overseas. That would have been logistically a very, very difficult process. They sent a small amount. They sent typically one flask of maybe 100 cc of vaccine, and each of those polio vaccine makers had another laboratory, the laboratory near to where the vaccination was taking place, grow the vaccine up in locally available tissue culture. So Albert Sabin sent his vaccine to places like Hungary and the Soviet Union in 1957, and it was grown up locally in laboratories in Budapest, in Moscow, in Leningrad, and so forth. From Paris, Pierre Lepine from the Pasteur Institute, he sent his vaccines out to places such as Brazzaville, in Congo-Brazzaville. It was then in French Equatorial Africa. And there again, apparently, they grew up the vaccine virus in the locally available tissue culture. There, the commonest monkey was Cercopithecus nictitans. So basically, although there was great control being exerted about how they developed the vaccine itself, how they attenuated the vaccine, they then grew it up in what was effectively locally available tissue. Now, they did their best, I'm sure, to make sure that monkeys, primates were used which were healthy, which didn't appear to be sick, but there was no final check made as to the material that was being fed to human beings. It was assumed that this stuff, the cells from the locally available primate, was going to be safe.
This contradicts Paul Osterrithe's testimony before the Royal Society, where he insisted that the polio vaccine could never have been prepared in Stanleyville. But in one of the lab's rare remaining official documents, we found 250,000 doses made for 250,000 people.
Yego niko babikoresha ko nibagirira hafi twebwe twari kure y'aho turi twarigaba abakoze nibo babyuka cyane kuko bazi kuzinduka abandi twarigaba tukararayo kwari urucanco rukomeye cyane atawusiba na buhoro buhoro candara
ubudacandazwe nawe jango umuntu akanga ntaje kwicandagisha ntacabiki
urumva hageze nk'umuntu reka kuja ku rucanco urumva hariho abatware baramenya bati mu rugo kwa naka ntibagiye ku rucanco urumva haraho ibintu nyene mugabo ntawe bapfunga ariko barabahimiriza rwose ku buryo bose bashobora kugenda barakurikirana cyane.
Between 1956 and 1960, more than 1 million people were ordered to receive Kaprowski's chat vaccine. When this was revealed, the World Health Organization immediately condemned these experiments.
It would be absolutely unfair if responsibility for this sequence of events, for the making of the vaccine in chimpanzee cells, was to fall solely on the shoulders of Paul Osterrieth. He was the corporal or sergeant, but we must look for the generals here. His boss, Ghislaine Courtois, the head of the medical laboratory in Stanleyville, clearly approved this course of action. There's no doubt about that. And just a few months before he began making the vaccine in chimp cells, Osterrieth was being trained in tissue culture techniques at the Wistar Institute, at the specific request of Hilary Kaprowski. The person with overall responsibility for this sequence of events, without a doubt, is Dr. Kaprowski. Without his approval, without his direction, this sequence of events would not have taken place.
I have no knowledge about it. I don't think the Belgians have knowledge about it. You should take his evidence with a grain of salt.
I mean, is it possible that this was done without you knowing, that chimpanzee kidneys were used without you knowing about it?
No, there was no possibility to do something like that.
From our trip to the Congo, we learned that the Lindy chimps and the Stanleyville laboratory facilitated the local production of the chat vaccine. But does that resolve the question of where AIDS originated? The impossibility of testing or gaining access to the Congo samples, if they still exist, will always cast a shadow upon the answer. For the moment, in the scientific community, the polio vaccine theory is dead. But the extraordinary convergence of Kaprowski's polio vaccination campaigns with the epicenter of AIDS might encourage them to investigate Edward Hooper's theory more closely. At the very least, questions are being raised about using monkey organs to make polio vaccines.
We should have stopped using monkey kidney tissues, I think, for virus production in 1960. And we've continued to do so. The drug companies are the ones who really determine this. They have developed facilities, they developed processes that would cost them a lot of money if they had to do it a different way. The thing that makes me physically angry is the fact that we now have the genetic ability to make synthetic polio vaccine from recombinant proteins, and we are not doing it. We continue to take ground up monkey parts and inject them into children.